Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we are going to unpack the chilling, highly calculated mechanics of extreme captivity. Specifically, we're looking at the complete systemic breakdown of human autonomy through the frankly harrowing case of Colleen Stan. Now, we aren't just looking at what happened to her, we are really going to analyze the architecture of how it happened. We want to understand, how does a human mind adapt to absolute, inescapable control?
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the roadmap that's going to guide us progressively through the system. First up, we'll look at the physical architecture of confinement. Then, we'll explore the invisible psychological prison, erasing the victim's identity, the weird illusion of normalcy, and finally, those deeply complex psychological survival mechanisms.
All right, part one, the architecture of confinement.
We have to begin with the very foundation of this control system, which is the physical environment itself. Her captor engineered a space designed not just to hold her, but to literally psychologically compress her. The dimensions were just 6 feet long, 2 to 3 feet wide, and roughly 2 feet high. We're talking about a wooden box hidden directly beneath the frame of a waterbed in her captor's home. I really want you to imagine the sensory reality of a space like this. It was built for long-term containment and absolute immobilization. She couldn't even sit upright. Inside this box, you have severe heat buildup, incredibly stale air, and total pitch-black darkness. Her circadian rhythms were entirely destroyed because there was absolutely zero natural light. The only sounds were muffled, just footsteps and the household living a completely normal life literally inches above her head. The physical design forced this constant, inescapable awareness of her own confinement. Now, out of a full 24-hour day, she was allowed out of that box for approximately 1 single hour. But listen, here is what you really need to understand. That 1 hour was not freedom, not at all. It was a highly controlled release designed purely to keep her from dying of physical immobility, muscle atrophy, and joint stiffness. She was given a bedpan inside the box, so this 1 hour out was just used for basic physical movement or chores, and she was always under very close supervision or physical restraint. This routine of predictable deprivation paired with controlled relief, that is a massive, calculated mechanism of control. It creates these intense anticipation cycles where the victim's entire existence just completely revolves around waiting for that 1 single hour.
Let's move to part two and see how this builds, the invisible psychological prison.
Because a physical box is really only the first layer. The true terror of this entire captivity system was the fabricated mental cage constructed by her captor, Cameron Hooker. To ensure she wouldn't even try to escape when she was out of the box for that 1 hour, he fabricated this massive, terrifying mythos called the company. He convinced her that this was a highly organized, totally ruthless secret network. According to his story, the company had thousands of members nationwide, a strict hierarchy, crazy advanced surveillance capabilities, and actual enforcement agents, basically hitmen. And the thing is, he didn't just tell her this, he actually produced fake documents, contracts, and organizational charts to prove it was legit. Because she was kept in total isolation with absolutely zero external information to contradict the lie, the sensory deprivation drastically increased her suggestibility. So to her, the company became an absolute, omnipresent reality.
By inventing the company, the captor executed a brilliant and frankly terrifying psychological maneuver. We call it an authority shift. Cameron positioned himself not as the ultimate boss, but merely as a low-level representative of this massive organization. So think about what that does. It shifts the victim's fear from a single individual, someone she might theoretically be able to overpower or run away from, to a sprawling, omnipotent entity. If she disobeyed or tried to run, the threat wasn't just that Cameron would find her. It was that the company would hunt her down, and even worse, that they would torture and kill her family back home. Physical escape suddenly seemed completely pointless because she truly believed she could never, ever escape the system itself.
Which brings us to part three, erasing the victim's identity.
With the physical and systemic threats firmly established, the captor then moved to systematically dismantle her original sense of self. To ensure long-term, unquestioning compliance, he literally had to erase who she was. So he forced her to sign this formalized document that he dubbed the slave contract. Now, from the outside looking in, you and I might think, well, it's just a piece of paper, right? It doesn't mean anything. But from inside the absolute sensory deprivation of her captivity, forcing her to physically sign that contract acted as a powerful cognitive anchor. It demanded total obedience and a permanent status as a slave to the company. It completely shifted the dynamics of her reality, giving her an internalized survival framework. That contract basically became the unquestionable law of her new universe.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate goal of all that erasure, a total replacement of self. The captor actually assigned her a brand new name, K. The original identity, Colleen Stan, had a family, she had autonomy and a past. But K was a controlled identity that existed only within the rigid rules of the system. This new identity was hammered in through constant, grueling repetition. Every command, every single interaction was directed at K, systematically overriding and burying her past self.
Now, obviously, a psychological shift like that doesn't just happen overnight. It is a very documented process of coerced identity reconstruction. It happens in distinct stages. Step 1 is just basic compliance. You're just doing what you're told to avoid immediate, severe punishment. Step 2 is adaptation, learning the bizarre rules of the new environment just to find tiny degrees of predictability so you don't go crazy. And step 3 is partial internalization. The human mind is just incredibly adaptive. To survive the profound, fatal psychological conflict of being tortured and imprisoned, the victim's mind eventually adopts the imposed role. Becoming K wasn't giving up. It was literally a way to survive the unendurable.
Moving right along to part 4, the illusion of normalcy.
Eventually, the captor forced the victim to navigate this bizarre, completely contrasting dual existence. Over time, she was actually forced into a public-facing role. She was brought out to help raise the captor's children, cook meals, and clean the house. She was directly involved in routine, everyday domestic life. But the absolute second those chores were done, she was abruptly stripped of all autonomy and forced right back into that immobilizing box under the bed. This stark juxtaposition is just almost impossible to wrap our heads around, right? She's serving a family dinner one moment and then locked in a pitch-black, coffin-like space the next.
And, well, that naturally leads to the most common question people ask when they hear about this case. When visitors came to the house and she was out there serving them, why didn't she just run? Why not scream for help? The answer is that her physical presence around visitors did not equal freedom. The intense psychological conditioning, the absolute terror of the company, and the total uncertainty of the catastrophic consequences meant she was effectively paralyzed. Those mental chains were just far heavier and far more secure than any physical lock could ever be.
This brings us to our final section, part 5, mechanisms of psychological survival.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it frames her behavior. To truly understand why she didn't run, we have to look inward at her incredible resilience and the actual clinical psychological mechanisms her brain deployed just to survive. First up is learned helplessness. This totally reframes our understanding of victim behavior because it's a scientifically documented response. When a human being is repeatedly taught that resistance equals severe punishment and that escape is functionally impossible, they quite literally stop trying. Her reduced attempts to escape over the years, those were not a sign of weakness or acceptance. Not at all. They were a biological and psychological adaptation to prolonged, inescapable trauma. She learned that, to survive, she had to rely entirely on the reality defined by her captor.
Another unbelievable survival tool her mind utilized is known as compartmentalization, or sometimes called splitting. She basically developed a strict mental separation. K was the compliant, obedient captive who went through the motions, cleaned the house, and endured the box. But deep inside, an internal observing self preserved the core of her original identity. This strategic psychological splitting is what allowed her to perform daily tasks and endure those extreme conditions without experiencing a constant, fatal mental breakdown. It's like K took the abuse so the core self could quietly survive in the background.
We also have to look at trauma bonding. This occurs when severe abuse is punctuated by intermittent relief. Remember that 1 hour out of the box we talked about? Those occasional, less threatening interactions, when contrasted with the sheer horror of the dark, suffocating confinement, created deep emotional confusion. Basically, her brain began to associate the captor, the very source of her terror, with relief and survival. It radically distorts a victim's perception, literally bonding them to the person holding the keys.
So, the crucial point is that the captor's end goal was never simply about holding a person in a room. It was about total transformation. It was a highly intentional, systemic breakdown of human autonomy meant to completely replace her reality framework. She lost all sense of the external world and accepted the internal rules of captivity because every single physical and psychological mechanism was designed from the ground up to enforce it.
One restricted the body. The other restricted the mind. This quote brilliantly summarizes the entire Colleen Stan captivity system. The physical architecture of that underbed box and the invisible psychological prison of the company work together in perfect, terrifying tandem. And it forces us to ask a deeply provocative question. If our entire reality, if our very identity, can be systematically overwritten by an architecture of fear, What is the true limit of the human mind's astonishing capacity to adapt and survive? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helps shed some light on the deeply complex realities of systemic captivity.